What if the story you are being told about this conflict is missing the most important half? What if the real war is not the one playing out in the footage you see on the news, but in a silent, accelerating race where every player is locking in position before the window closes permanently? Right now, Israel is moving faster than at any point in this conflict. Iran is bleeding revenue it cannot replace. A deal that was described as almost finished 3 weeks ago remains unsigned while military operation continue reshaping the facts it was supposed to govern. And somewhere between all of this, the decisions being made this week in the Middle East are pointing directly at the price of fuel, the cost of food, and the interest rate on your mortgage. The world changed overnight, and almost nobody explained to you how or why. If the kind of analysis that actually connects these dots is what you are looking for, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss a video like this, and share it with one person today who is trying to make sense of what is happening, not just collect headlines. Let us start where the overnight change became impossible to ignore. Because this story does not begin with a missile or a diplomatic statement. It begins with a castle, an actual stone fortress, nearly 9 centuries old, sitting on a cliff above the Litani River in southern Lebanon. It is called Beaufort Castle, and last weekend Israel raised its flag over it for the first time in 26 years. That single image, a flag planted on ancient stone walls overlooking the valleys below, tells you more about the direction of this conflict than any official press release issued in the hours that followed, because this did not happen during a period of open warfare. It happened under an active ceasefire, 2 days before Israel and Lebanon were scheduled to sit down for diplomatic talks in Washington. Hold that timeline clearly in your mind. Under a ceasefire, 48 hours before scheduled peace negotiations, Israel seized a medieval hilltop fortress and described it not as a temporary tactical move, but as a permanent position. Now, why does a castle built in the 12th century matter in a 21st century conflict? Because geography does not become obsolete. Beaufort sits on the highest ground in the entire southern Lebanese operational theater. From those walls, you can see every valley route leading directly into northern Israel, every movement, every column, every line of approach. Hezbollah understood this precisely. They used that position for exactly what it was built for, to observe and direct operations across the valleys below. Seizing it was not symbolic. It was the capture of the single most strategically valuable piece of terrain in the entire zone. And the language Israeli officials chose afterward was not the language of a raid. It was the language of a landlord. Prime Minister Netanyahu called it a dramatic shift in policy. The word permanent appeared in official Israeli government statements describing a military presence inside a neighboring sovereign country under an active ceasefire 2 days before peace talks. That word was not accidental. It was a position statement delivered in stone and flagpole. Now step back and absorb the full scale of what Israel currently controls inside Lebanon. Because the castle is the symbol, the scale is the actual story. Israeli forces are currently holding approximately 2,000 square kilometers of Lebanese territory. That is roughly 1/5 of the entire country. The deepest Israeli military presence in Lebanon in more than a quarter century. They have advanced to the outskirts of Nabatee, one of the largest population centers in the south. The entire occupied zone has been described not as a temporary buffer arrangement pending negotiation, but as a position Israel intends to maintain. If you are the Lebanese government, if you are Hezbollah, if you are any of the international actors now expected to sit down in Washington and negotiate a framework that was designed for a different reality, you are looking at a situation the talks were never built to address. The negotiation has been handed a set of facts it was never designed to prevent. And that is precisely how it was structured to function. Hezbollah did not absorb this quietly. Over the same weekend, more than 50 rockets and a wave of drones were launched into northern Israel. Schools near the border were closed. An explosive drone killed a 21-year-old Israeli soldier, an only child who had arrived from Ukraine with his mother 6 years earlier. That detail belongs in this analysis not as sentiment, but as the real unit of measurement in every strategic calculation being conducted at the level of ridge lines and leverage. There are real people paying the actual cost of every position paper and every flag planting in real time every single day. And here is the part that the strategic framing does not fully resolve. Israel captured the high ground. Israel took the castle, and the rockets came anyway. Controlling terrain and eliminating a threat are not the same calculation. They are a bet, a specific and costly bet, that over time the positional advantage will translate into intelligence superiority, better fire control, and eventually the degradation of the capacity to attack. That bet may ultimately prove correct. But the rockets flying in the hours after the flag went up tell you clearly that the dividend is not immediate. The cost is being paid today. The strategic return is still somewhere in the future. Now travel to the water. Because the Strait of Hormuz is where this story stops being a regional conflict and starts being a story about every person on Earth who buys fuel, pays for groceries, or holds a mortgage. Last weekend, a United States aircraft fired a Hellfire missile into the engine room of a commercial vessel called the MV Leon Star in the Gulf of Oman. Central Command stated that more than 20 warnings were issued. The crew did not respond. The missile went in. The ship was dead in the water. That is now 5 commercial ships that American military forces have physically disabled since a naval blockade began in mid-April. More than 100 additional vessels have been redirected away from Iran-bound routes through interceptions, warnings, and the entirely credible example of what happened to the Leon Star. Let that picture settle completely. The United States Navy is currently enforcing a blockade of the world's most critical oil corridor by firing on vessels that attempt to run it. This has been the operational reality for approximately 7 weeks. Before this conflict began, roughly 1/5 of the world's entire seaborne oil supply passed through that strait every single day. That flow has been effectively strangled since the conflict started. Pentagon estimates put the cost to Iran at approximately $8 billion in lost oil revenue. That is the pressure mechanism. That is the instrument designed to pull Tehran toward a negotiating table. But here's the condition that makes this situation genuinely extraordinary. At the exact same moment the United States is firing missiles at ships to enforce the blockade, it is also working to finalize a diplomatic agreement that would end the blockade entirely. Both operations are running simultaneously. The hellfire going into the engine room and the diplomatic statements about a deal being close to signed are products of the identical strategic calculation. The blockade creates the pressure. The pressure makes the deal theoretically possible. The deal is supposed to make the blockade unnecessary. This is a negotiation being conducted through gunfire, which is either the most precise form of coercive diplomacy ever attempted or a situation with a very specific and unintended failure mode that neither side is publicly modeling. Now, let us be direct about what this oil story means for the person watching this video who does not represent a government or command a military force. When the strait effectively seized up, oil prices did not drift gradually higher. They moved with a speed and severity that commodity markets had not experienced in years. Brent crude jumped approximately 65% inside a single month. By late April, it was trading near $118 per barrel. The World Bank classified this event as the largest oil market disruption in recorded history. Not one of the largest, the largest. Global oil supply collapsed by more than 10 million barrels per day in March alone. To put that in context, the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 restructured the Western economic order for an entire decade. The current disruption is larger in absolute volume than either of those events. Analysts at major investment banks published research modeling scenarios where a sustained closure of the strait pushed oil above $200 per barrel. That is not a tail risk footnote. That is a central forecast built from conditions that were already in place at the time of publication. And $200 oil does not stay inside the oil market. It moves through every sector of every economy that runs on petroleum, gasoline, diesel, fertilizer, food production costs. The inflation figure that determines whether central banks can ease monetary policy or are forced to tighten again. The interest rate that decides whether you can afford to refinance a house or whether a business can borrow to keep its workforce employed. I'm Maj. Jessica Anderson, and the line from a Hellfire missile fired into a ship's engine room in the Gulf of Oman to the number on your fuel pump at home is short and it is direct. This is not a foreign policy story dressed in civilian language. This is a kitchen table story that has been filed under geopolitics because the geopolitics are visible and the household consequences are distributed across tens of millions of individual budgets that no camera crew for photographs. And there is a signal in how markets have been responding that deserves very careful attention. When recent American announcements about easing the Strait situation reached trading floors, oil prices barely moved. Brent crude essentially flatlined in response to news that in the early weeks of the crisis would have sent prices sharply higher. Traders have stopped treating official statements as actionable information. They learned through a repeated pattern of optimistic language, followed by unchanged operational reality on the water, that the announcement is not the outcome. When prices stop responding to good news, it means the people with real capital at stake have decided the good news does not accurately describe the situation on the water. That is a calibrated judgment about institutional credibility, delivered through market behavior rather than commentary. And it tells you that the window in which a genuine resolution of the Strait crisis would produce meaningful price relief for ordinary households is narrowing every single week that the deal remains unsigned. Pause here for a moment, because what comes next takes this story to the layer that most coverage never reaches. If you are still here, you are clearly trying to understand the actual picture, not just track the surface events. Do something specific right now. Go to the comments and type the single word leverage, just that word. It helps this video reach more people who think the way you do. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Now let us go deeper. Iran's strategy through all of this deserves examination on its own terms because it is considerably more sophisticated than the phrase blockade. Runner implies. Iran is not attempting to win a naval engagement against the United States. It knows with complete precision that it cannot. Its surface naval capability was severely degraded in the opening phase of the conflict. What Iran is doing instead is executing a doctrine of asymmetric maritime pressure with one specific, clearly defined objective. Mines appearing near Omani waters in the approaches to the strait. Small, fast attack vessels, cheap and numerous, built to swarm rather than to fight conventionally. One-way attack drones launched from coastal installations. This is the complete instrument set of an actor that cannot defeat its adversary, but has decided that defeat is not the objective. The objective is cost. You do not need to defeat the United States Navy. You need to make global insurance markets uncertain enough and shipping rates elevated enough and energy markets anxious enough that the continuous economic pressure on the global system eventually converts into political pressure on your adversary to accept a deal on terms you can survive. And alongside the active harassment, there is a passive dimension to the strategy that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Ships transiting the strait with their automatic identification systems switched off, going completely dark, moving along the Omani coastline where proximity to territorial waters provides partial operational cover. A Greek supertanker reportedly carrying 2 million barrels made a successful transit recently using precisely these methods with United States Navy. Helicopters flying close escort. A Chinese-owned vessel used nearly identical tactics. The strait is not closed. It is not open. It exists in a state of suspended operational ambiguity where commerce moves only through methods that belong in an intelligence novel rather than in the routine functioning of global energy infrastructure. That ambiguity is not a byproduct of the conflict's unresolved status. It is a product being deliberately manufactured. Uncertainty is what Iran is producing. Elevated risk premiums are what Iran is offering to the global energy market as a substitute for the conventional military leverage it no longer possesses. Now the diplomacy. Because the negotiation is where all of this military pressure, every captured fortress and disabled ship and eliminated commander is supposed to eventually resolve into something resembling a durable outcome. And the negotiation right now is in the most contradictory condition imaginable. The United States and Iran are reportedly within reach of a 60-day memorandum of understanding that would extend the ceasefire, begin reopening the strait to commercial traffic, and establish a framework for broader discussions on Iran's nuclear program. Senior American officials have said publicly that negotiators are working through language, that progress has been made, that Iran appears to genuinely want the strait operating normally again. The deal has been described as largely negotiated and nearly ready to announce. And yet, the deal has not been signed. The remaining sticking points are not procedural gaps that skilled drafting can close. They are the hardest substantive questions any nuclear negotiation with Iran has ever been required to answer. Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium at 60% purity. The American position has been stated explicitly: no sanctions relief until Iran agrees to transfer that stockpile. Two destinations have been discussed: transfer to the United States directly or internationally verified destruction. And a senior Iranian source described to a major news agency a situation in which Tehran has not agreed to relinquish the enriched material at all, and in which the nuclear question was not considered part of the preliminary framework under discussion. Two sides, one describing a deal that resolves Iran's nuclear material, one describing a deal in which nuclear material is not yet on the table. Those are not two different characterizations of the same agreement. Those are two different agreements, and the distance between them is not a drafting gap that closes in an afternoon. It is the same fundamental incomprehensions that has defined the Iran nuclear dispute for 20 years, resurfacing now in identical form. Add Iran's ballistic missile program. That is not something the hardline faction inside Tehran will negotiate inside a preliminary framework designed to pause an active military conflict. It represents the other structural pillar of Iran's deterrent, and limiting it would require a domestic political consensus inside Iran that does not currently exist. Add the question of transit fees. Iran has never formally abandoned this claim. It has only rebranded it as an environmental contribution. The United States has sanctioned the authority Iran created to collect it and described any passage fee for the strait as a violation of international maritime law. And the ceasefire on the Iranian side is being enforced, or more precisely not enforced, by the same Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that launched drones at an American base in Kuwait the day after Washington made a unilateral concession to preserve the ceasefire framework. The pattern of RGB behavior during pause periods has become consistent enough to constitute a doctrine. An American concession is treated as an opportunity to extract further leverage rather than as a signal of good faith to be reciprocated. That pattern is now the analytical framework inside which the American negotiating team has to operate. Because the question of what Iran will honor after signing cannot be separated from the question of what Iran has been doing throughout the entire period of negotiation. Israel's seizure of Beaufort Castle connects to all of this through a logic that Israeli officials have been articulating clearly enough for anyone paying close attention to hear. Israel looks at a potential United States-Iran agreement and sees a specific risk, not because of what the current draft says about Hezbollah or about Lebanon's sovereignty. The preliminary framework is focused on the strait and on the nuclear question. The risk Israel sees is temporal. A deal that pauses the conflict creates breathing room. Breathing room allows Hezbollah to rebuild command structures that have been severely degraded throughout the campaign. It allows Iran to reconstitute supply lines that have been disrupted. It allows the entire regional network, battered as it currently is, to use the pause as a recovery interval rather than accept it as a genuine resolution. So the calculation Israel appears to have made is the one the castle seizure expresses in the clearest possible physical terms. Establish facts on the ground now before any agreement freezes the operational lines in place. Seize the positions that provide strategic advantage before a diplomatic framework converts the current military situation into a permanent political one. You do not enter a negotiation having surrendered the high ground. You enter from the high ground and now you hold it. And then there is Gaza. the front that has been partially absorbed by the broader regional noise, but carries its own compounding internal logic. The Hamas military commander Israel eliminated last weekend had held the position for approximately 1 week. He had been appointed as the successor to the previous commander, who was killed in an Israeli strike roughly 2 weeks before that. Consider that rhythm carefully. Israel eliminates the head of Hamas's military wing. Hamas appoints a replacement. Within approximately 2 weeks, that replacement is also dead. This pattern has repeated across multiple leadership generations throughout the duration of this conflict. And it raises a question that serious analysts have been circling with deliberate caution because it is genuinely uncomfortable and no official is prepared to state it directly. At what point does a sustained leadership elimination strategy stop degrading the organization and begin selecting for the specific type of leader the strategy cannot locate? When you eliminate every commander who steps forward and can be identified, eventually the survivors are precisely those who learned never to step forward in any way that generates a traceable signature. The organization does not necessarily produce better commanders in the conventional sense. It produces commanders specifically shaped for invisibility. Whether the current pattern is producing a weakened Hamas or a restructured Hamas is a question military planners are working through quietly. 2 military wing commanders killed within 3 weeks does not answer it definitively in either direction. Now hold all of these fronts simultaneously. Lebanon, where Israeli forces are using the word permanent to describe their presence across 1/5 of a sovereign neighboring country, and where Washington negotiations opened with Israel already holding terrain no previous framework was designed to accommodate. The Strait of Hormuz, where the United States Navy is firing Hellfire missiles into engine rooms while simultaneously pursuing the agreement that would render those strikes unnecessary. The negotiating table, where a deal described as nearly complete remains unsigned because the hardest questions about nuclear material, missile programs, transit fees, and Iranian factional politics have not been resolved, only deferred into language flexible enough that both sides can describe entirely different agreements using the same words. The open sea, where Iran is manufacturing uncertainty through mines, fast attack boats, and dark-running tankers escorted by American naval helicopters. And Gaza, where the leadership elimination campaign continues at a pace that has consumed 2 military wing commanders in 3 weeks, and where the political endgame remains as unresolved today as it was the day this conflict began. 5 fronts, all moving simultaneously, all connected by a single thread: leverage. The frantic accumulation of leverage by every actor who has concluded that whatever agreement eventually closes this conflict will lock in a balance of power they are racing to tilt in their favor before the lock engages. The World Bank has classified the current oil disruption as the largest in recorded history. The inflation it has generated in energy-dependent economies is running at the highest levels in years. Central banks around the world are holding interest decisions that are partially hostage to an energy price variable being determined by military operations in a maritime choke point thousands of miles from the populations their policy is designed to serve. A deal that reopens the strait does not immediately reverse all of this. Supply chains reconfigured around alternative routes take time to shift back. Insurance markets that have repriced entire categories of maritime risk take time to normalize. Iranian energy infrastructure that has been physically damaged takes far longer than a diplomatic announcement to rebuild. But a signed agreement creates the conditions for the unwinding to begin. A collapse of negotiations creates the conditions for the next escalation, which analysts have characterized not as a gradual intensification, but as a step-change event in which $200 oil moves from a scenario to a central one. Both roads are genuinely available right now. Neither one is closed. The 60-day memorandum of understanding is sitting on a table that 2 parties are simultaneously declining to sign while both conduct military operations that are actively changing the facts the memorandum would need to govern. And so the question that everything in this analysis keeps returning to: on the morning after a castle was seized in Lebanon, and a ship was disabled in Oman, and a Hamas commander was killed in Gaza, and a deal was described as almost ready to announce for the fourth consecutive week without being announced, is this. Is this the moment when every party in the conflict has independently concluded that grabbing more leverage right now is less risky than trusting the terms currently on the table? When escalation has become the simultaneously rational choice for every actor at once, what specifically is the mechanism that stops it from accelerating? Not the diplomatic aspiration, the actual mechanism, the specific pressure point or exhaustion threshold or external shock that converts simultaneous escalation into genuine de-escalation. Because optimistic statements about agreements that are almost signed are not a mechanism. And the flag flying over Beaufort Castle tonight, visible from every approach in the valley below, is a very specific answer to what every party in this conflict currently believes about where the lines are. They believe the lines are still moving. They believe the window is still open. And they are all moving through it as fast as they can before someone on the other side closes it. The real question, the one no government is answering in public and no negotiating table has actually been authorized to resolve, is how much of that window remains. And what happens to every person, every economy, every household that was priced on the assumption that it closes cleanly rather than slamming shut on everything still caught inside it when it finally does. This story is not over. It is not even close to over. And now you understand exactly why. If this gave you a clearer picture of something the daily news cycle never fully explained, do one thing before you leave. Share this video with one person today. Someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening, not just what the headlines say happened. Because understanding this is not only about geopolitics, it is about knowing what is coming for all of us. Subscribe if you are not already here, and we will keep bringing you the analysis that actually matters.